Hello, everyone. Welcome to GirlCon 2025. We will get started shortly.
Welcome to GirlCon Digital 2025. I'm Kyla Guru, pronouns she, her, and I'm one of the co-founders of GirlCon. We are thrilled to be hosting you for our 8th annual conference. What an incredible milestone to reach as an ever-expanding community. Your presence here means the world to us, and we're so grateful that you've chosen to join us today.
Thanks, Kyla. Hi, everyone. My name is Carissa, and I am one of the co-directors of GirlCon 2025. I will be an incoming freshman at Harvard University this fall, studying computer science, environmental science, and public policy. Back in 2018, GirlCon began as an annual student-run conference with the purpose to provide a safe space for female and non-binary students to network and lead in technology. Now, we continue to grow not only as a conference, but as a movement. We host this conference annually to remind students to raise their hands, take the mic, create waves of change, and now ignite your flame.
Absolutely, Carissa. I could not be more excited to be here supporting that mission. Hello, everyone. My name is Emma Lopez, pronouns she, her, and I'm the other co-director this year. Currently, I'm an incoming freshman at Stanford University studying computer science and design this fall. Throughout the past 8 years, we have brought over 3,500 passionate attendees and dedicated team members to make a difference in the next generation of female leaders in tech. Looking back at these past 8 years, our first conference in 2018 was held at Northwestern University, where we welcomed 200 attendees. Our second conference in 2019 was held at Google, and we had 250 attendees. In 2020, we went virtual, redesigning our conference to no longer just be Chicago-based, but available internationally. We were delighted to unite over 700 students there. In 2021, we had over 900 attendees from over 25 countries. And in 2022, we expanded further to utilize a hybrid model that incorporates both online and in-person aspects. In 2023, we continued this hybrid model with a successful in-person and virtual conference, along with hosting our first CME x Google Innovation Challenge, and also our first ever GirlCon chapter conference, GirlCon Texas. Last year, in 2024, we used our hybrid model for the third year in a row, welcoming 600 plus young women and gender expansive teens at our conference, where we hosted our second CME x Google Innovation Challenge and our second GirlCon chapter conference, GirlCon India. What makes GirlCon so magical is truly the people. So make sure to join tomorrow's lunch networking session and meet some new friends in sessions you attend. Our community is better with you here, sharing your voice with us.
Hello everyone, my name is Morgan, pronouns she, her. I am a senior vice president at GirlCon this year and an incoming college freshman studying computer science and public policy this fall. We want to take a second to recognize the amazing groups and individuals that make GirlCon possible. GirlCon would not be what it is without the incredible sponsors and companies that have supported our growth. This year, we have been able to raise more than $9,000 in order to make sure that GirlCon 2025 was possible. Moreover, we would not be here today without the GirlCon core team. The core team has worked tirelessly over the past year to ideate, plan, and smoothly execute each part of the conference. We turned a dream into reality with GirlCon 2025. We are so excited to move through this weekend and see our palpable fingerprints through each moment of inspiration. To the entire team, thank you, thank you, thank you for carrying our mission onward and upward. You inspire us to dream bigger every year.
Hi everyone, my name is Zoe Meza, and I'll be an incoming freshman at MIT studying computer science, data science, and economics. This year, GirlCon has chosen to place emphasis on goal setting, empowering ourselves, and persevering through our challenges in order to shine bright. To kick off GirlCon 2025, we encourage you to take part in our hashtag Ignite Your Flame social media challenge and share what your goals are for your future and what motivates you throughout this weekend. We can't wait for another amazing year of GirlCon.
Hi everyone, my name is Thea and I'm a rising senior at Stevenson High School. As Emma mentioned earlier, every year has been a milestone for GirlCon. From just 200 attendees around the Chicagoland area, our conference has grown to now over 1,000 attendees from 35 different countries across the globe. For us, these aren't just numbers, but a representation of the impact GirlCon has been able to make on students across the globe. We want to thank each and every one of you for signing up, taking time out of your summers, and spending it with us. We also want to give a huge thanks to all of our wonderful speakers. Without you, this conference truly would not be able to function. And as a past attendee at many of your sessions, you inspire each and every one of us to reach higher and make an impact in this world. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules and being here with us.
Thanks, Dia. Hi, everyone. My name is Vivian, and I'm going to be a sophomore at DePaul College Prep. This year, we have had the unique opportunity of hosting a hybrid conference with sessions happening both virtually and in person. In order to make sure this week is as inspiring and impactful as possible, we highly encourage you all to please keep your camera on if you are comfortable. Please note that several of the sessions will be recorded while the presenter is speaking and posted as unlisted for only GirlCon registrants to view afterwards. Additionally, please use the chat features as much as possible to introduce your name, pronouns, where you're from, and also react to content with emojis and ask as many questions as you can think of. Not to mention, engaging more this week gives you a greater chance at receiving the ultimate swag bags.
Hi everyone, my name is Zara and I'm a rising senior at Naperville Central High School. This year we have so much cool swag like stickers, t-shirts, bags, sunglasses, and more. However, we only have 300 swag bags this year. So to make sure that you have a chance to win one, make sure to participate in our social media challenges. For information on how to participate, check your email or check out our GirlCon Instagram for more information. When you're posting, please make sure to tag @GirlConTech on all social media platforms and to use our hashtag #IgniteYourFlame.
Hi everyone, my name is Allison and I'll be a junior at the Illinois Math and Science Academy this coming fall. We are so glad you all made it to this opening ceremony and got the calendar invite, as this is how you'll join all of your sessions. The attendee-only page on our website contains all the Zoom links, allowing you to attend any session that interests you during the conference. All breakout sessions will happen on Zoom, and keynotes and large sessions like this one will be Zoom webinars. If you have any questions throughout the conference, feel free to email us or DM us on social media. Thank you again for being here today.
Thanks, Allison. My name is Kritika, and I'm going to be an incoming junior at Stevenson this year. I'd like to start off by thanking all of our GirlCon 2025 sponsors for all the support they've provided us in the past, but especially this year. I'm so grateful to be part of the GirlCon core team and to work with all these amazing companies. Thank you in specific to All Rise Legal Counsel, Northwestern Sierra, Exelon, IntelliGuards, The Network, Bear Right LLC, and donors from our GirlCon Family and Friends campaign. We truly appreciate all you've done for us. I'd like to now extend a huge thank you to our returning gold and partner sponsors, ISACA Chicago Chapter and CME Group. Additionally, thank you so much to our fiscal sponsor, Bits and Bytes Cybersecurity.
If you have any questions at all throughout this entire virtual process, feel free to reach out to our email, team@girlcon.org, or DM us on Instagram @GirlConTech. And don't forget to have fun. We hope that this will be a fun learning and growing experience for everyone. With that being said, we are so excited to welcome GirlCon 2025's first keynote speaker. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rebecca Willett, Professor of Statistics and Computer Science at the University of Chicago and Faculty Director of AI at the Data Science Institute. Her research advances the mathematical foundations of machine learning with broad impact across science. She holds leadership roles in major national AI and data science institutes and is deeply engaged in shaping the future of AI through research, policy, and community building. Today, she'll share insights on the key challenges and opportunities related to AI and how a research career can put you at the forefront of discovery. I'll pass it on to Professor Willett.
Thank you so much. It is an honor and a pleasure to be with you all here today. I think the GirlCon conference series is very exciting, and I am delighted to be a part of it. So as you just heard, I am a professor at the University of Chicago, where my research focus is on AI and machine learning. When I was a graduate student, I was working at Rice University, and I was studying medical imaging. So I went across the street to the hospital to talk to a collaborator. And when I was there in the elevator, they had a sign. And the sign said, if you sign up for our fMRI study, we'll give you a CD with all of your brain data. I thought this would be very fun and exciting. I immediately signed up. And what they were trying to do is understand the way our brains function, and in particular, how our brains respond to pleasure. And the way that they would study this is they would scan our brains while they were feeding us Kool-Aid, basically. It was very interesting, and I learned a lot. But a few weeks later, I got a call from the professor who was running this whole experiment. And he said, Becca, when we started analyzing all of the data from this experiment, we got to yours, and we actually saw a tumor, a meningioma. So we said, you know, this was a scanner designed for experiments. You really need to go get a clinical scan. And I did, and they were able to remove it. Everything was totally benign, and I was just extremely fortunate. Never had any kinds of symptoms or side effects. But I think this is an interesting story to think about today, because AI and machine learning are impacting almost every single step of the process that I just described to you. It's affecting the way that neuroscientists design their experiments, the way that scanners collect data, the way we take that data and form images and analyze those images, the way that they decide whether or not surgery is a good option, quantifying patient risk, and even thinking about or changing what pharmaceuticals are prescribed after surgery. And healthcare is not the only area where there's the potential for fundamental transformation caused by AI. So not only is it accelerating innovation in healthcare, but it's also transforming the way that we conduct scientific discovery. It's already helped us predict the structure of proteins and DNA. It's helping us develop a new understanding of the laws of nature and rules of life, and even understand the early seeds of structure in the universe after the Big Bang. And even outside the natural sciences, we see AI changing the way that we think about culture and history, the way we analyze records, the way that we develop data-driven policies. It's inspiring new legal paradigms and influencing markets, economies, and society. But I think that if you look at the news media and the way it describes AI and machine learning, you might see this as like a magic black box that can produce miraculous outputs. Those advances are very exciting. But the point I would like to make today is that developing applied AI and machine learning without understanding the underlying foundations, and mathematical foundations in particular, is akin to developing biotech without understanding biology. We might get lucky, we might hit on a few discoveries, but we won't be as efficient or as accurate or as transformative as we would be without that foundational understanding. So let's talk a bit about how these state-of-the-art methods that many of you have already experimented with and encountered are actually working. So at its heart, machine learning is often about learning by example. So think about when you were a kid and learning about the differences between cats and dogs, how to distinguish a cat from a dog. So you would see lots of examples, say at the park or in picture books or on TV. And maybe a grown-up would tell you things or point out different features, such as the pointiness of the ears or the size of the animal. And after seeing lots of examples like this, you would eventually form a mental model of how you can distinguish what's a cat from what's a dog, so that then when you later on encounter a new animal, you can correctly classify it. So when we perform machine learning, we're doing something very similar. We start with a collection of images of cats and dogs, for instance, and we extract features from those images, things like the size or the ear pointiness, and maybe assign numbers to those features. We also, for each one of the images, have a label, say +1 for dogs and -1 for cats. And then what we do is we try to learn a model, say a dividing line between the cats or the dogs, so that when we encounter a new animal, we accurately predict what type of animal it is. So when we think about placing this dividing line between the cats and the dogs, we can think about it as follows. We're trying to predict a label, which I'm going to call Y here, that as a weighted sum of the features, say the feature X1 or the ear pointiness X2. And so we can multiply X1 by one weight and X2 by another weight, add them up, and then see if it's above or below a threshold. And these weights in the threshold essentially tell us where this dividing line is. And so we're using all of these examples to figure out where a good dividing line is. Now, this sounds very, very simple, and like it couldn't possibly do all the miraculous things we've seen machine learning do in recent years. But in fact, this is just a fundamental building block of almost all of modern machine learning. And just to see how powerful this very simple idea is, imagine for a moment that our training data looked something like this, right? If we plotted all the dogs in cyan and the cats in red, according to their size and ear pointiness, imagine that the data was distributed like this. So this idea of finding a dividing line suddenly seems impossible, right? No matter where I put the dividing line, there's no way I can really separate the cats and dogs. So this simple model that I presented feels like it's not going to get us very far. But we can do things like create new features, say the square of the ear pointiness plus the square of the size. So that now we've got three features, right? This new feature that we just created, and ear pointiness and size. And now if we plot all of our examples in this 3D space, we can see that in fact there is a very nice clean separation between the two different animals. And that separation is just a weighted sum of these three different features after thresholding. And so this core idea that I just described to you is really a building block of much of machine learning that we can generalize and use in a variety of contexts. So we started with this idea, we've got a weighted sum of two different features that we threshold. A little bit more generally, we could have a weighted sum of a large number of features, say P. And after we compute that weighted sum, we could do something perhaps a little bit different from a threshold, so some nonlinear operation to produce a prediction Y hat. So when people talk about neural networks or deep learning, they're basically talking about taking this building block that I just described and daisy chaining a bunch of them together to form much larger and more complex networks. So we can think about this building block. I'm going to represent it a little bit more cartoonishly and graphically using these blobs corresponding to features or to outputs, predictions, and these lines corresponding to weights and weighted sums, followed by this nonlinear activation. And so when you see a deep network, you can look at groups of nodes like this, and they correspond exactly to this building block that I've been describing, so that we can input an image, say each of these blobs could correspond to one of the pixels. We repeat this process of weighted sums followed by a nonlinearity like I just described, until finally we get a collection of outputs. And those outputs could correspond to, for instance, is there a cat in the image? Is there a dog in the image? Is there a mouse in the image? Is there a boat in the image, etc.? And so with this, we can all of a sudden start to perform very sophisticated operations and, for instance, identify the contents of much more complex and varied images. So this is how we maybe construct these things, potentially with some additional bells and whistles that I'm not describing today. But I'd like to think about, well, what happens when we actually build these complicated things? What are these neural networks actually doing that allows them to classify these much more complicated images or conduct other more complex tasks? And one of the things that we can do is we can figure out within these neural networks what kind of information is being represented. So if I were to feed in an image on the left here, and these cyan points, say corresponding to the pixels of the image, then I can look and see what's being sort of output by some nodes sort of early in the network. What kinds of image features are being represented? And early in the network, what we're representing are low-level features of the images. Things like, where are their lines or where are their edges? As we go further into the network, we start seeing additional features that correspond a little bit more to the component parts of the types of objects that are being fed in. So when we feed in faces, we see that we're representing things like eyes and noses and mouths. Or when we feed in cars, we might see windows or wheels. Or when we see elephants, we might see animal body parts. And then finally, when we get to late level nodes or even the penultimate layer, then we start seeing much higher level features that are directly related to the semantic content of the image. So when we're feeding in faces, we start to see features that look like parts of faces, or we start seeing parts of cars or parts of elephants emerge. And this is very important, thinking about what kind of information is being represented by these networks. Because if we were trying to distinguish, say, different animals based on just pixel values, without extracting these higher level features, it would be very challenging. One of the reasons it's challenging is because you can find often multiple images that are very similar visually in terms of low-level features or pixel values, but in terms of the content are very different, right? For each of these pairs, we've got two different animals. One's a dog and one's a cat. And in terms of the raw pixel values, they look very similar. But in terms of our tasks, say differentiating cats and dogs, they're completely different. And so when we train these neural networks, effectively what's happening is we are learning to extract features of the images that are salient to our task at hand, in this case, separating or differentiating between cats and dogs, as opposed to focusing exclusively on superficial visual features or low-level features like edges and colors. And so what's happening then is we can think about ways that we represent images, not just in terms of their raw pixel values, but in terms of what is output by these different nodes in the network. So instead of thinking about this image of a cat as a list of pixel colors, I can represent it as a list of the different features being output by these intermediate nodes. And this is helpful because now I could, for instance, make a plot of where these different images are in some new learned feature space, where one axis, for instance, could correspond to the output value of the fourth neuron in the eighth hidden layer, and another axis might correspond to the output value of the third neuron in the eighth hidden layer. And what we see is that then within this learned feature space, often we'll have objects that are related to each other according to our task, in this case separating cats and dogs, being close together in the learned feature space, and images that look very similar on a superficial pixel level, all of a sudden being very far apart in this learned feature space because they represent different content. So once we've learned representations, new representations of data, such as images, we can start doing all different sorts of things. For example, we can think about things like semantic morphing. So imagine, for instance, that we wanted to have an image that looks something like a mixture between a teddy bear and a Persian cat. So we don't want to necessarily create sort of a blended overlay image of these two images, but rather we want to think about what would an entirely new creature that looks like a morphing of a teddy bear and a cat look like. And by using these learned representations, we can actually kind of almost with a slider think about the different representations of the animals, all the way from things that look more like cats to things that look more like teddy bears and something in between. And we can do this with all different sorts of images. These latent representations are also useful when we start thinking about generating new images in a way that you might have already seen or played around with things like DALL-E or Midjourney or other image generation tools. So one way that people do this, for instance, is they take advantage of the fact that we can actually add distortions to images very easily and then learn how to undo those distortions. So for example, I could take an image of a dog and I could just add a little bit of noise, a little bit of error to each pixel to get sort of a grainier image of a dog. And then I can add a little bit more noise. It looks even grainier, a little bit more noise. And I can just repeat this a bunch of times until I finally get an image that looks totally random, like there's no content or structure there whatsoever. Then what people do is they learn a neural network, or they train a neural network to map one of these noisy images to a slightly less noisy image. Now, this is a hard thing to do. It's much harder to undo a distortion or undo errors than to generate errors. But we can, with tons and tons of data, train networks to do this very effectively. And so then what we can do to generate a new image is to take a totally random set of initial pixels and then feed it through our neural network that's doing this noise removal and do it over and over and over again until finally we get a nice clean image. So here's an illustration of this in progress. So we're going to see a total or a collection of different images all being generated in parallel. So each one of these blocks corresponds to a totally new random image. Then we're going to feed each one of them into our neural network. And as we do that, we start to see structure emerge, and finally we get nice, clean, crisp images. And I'll just show that again. We start with pure noise. We continuously, over many, many steps, remove that noise in order to produce new generated images. Now, we've been talking a lot about images because it's so tangible and easy to visualize. But of course, another type of generative model that is associated with AI and machine learning is our large language models, things like ChatGPT, for instance. So how do these work? Well, imagine that we give it a prompt. Say, Becca's very good boy Gimli begged for a... And now what the large language model is going to do is it's going to try to predict a good next word for that sentence. So it's going to have a whole dictionary of different words that it could use after this prompt. It could complete it with bone, spaceship, leash, beer, ball, etc. And some of these are more likely ends to this sentence than others. And so where we use the neural networks or machine learning is to make good predictions of the likelihood of the next word of the sentence being any of these possible completions. So maybe bone is very likely as a next word, and spaceship is pretty unlikely. Leash is medium likely, especially if it corresponds to a walk. Beer, medium, and ball, medium high. At least for my dog, it doesn't like balls. So what neural networks are doing is they're predicting the probability of each next word based on the past words, say the words in the prompt. And once we have that probability, then we can draw one of the next words at random, where words that have higher probability like bone are going to be very likely to be chosen, and words like spaceship that have very low probability are very unlikely to be chosen. And so the generated text is random, right? We're making a random draw based on these likelihood estimates. And yet we're, with high probability, going to generate text that is very plausible or that sounds very reasonable to humans. Now, like I said, there's been just a ton of progress in AI and machine learning in recent years. It's extremely exciting field, but I would absolutely say that we are far from done. There's many challenges that remain and lots of opportunities for you all to continue to study this and help make progress in this field. And so let me outline some of the challenges that arise as we think about, next stages of AI and machine learning. So I already mentioned that when we are training these models, we're using lots of examples, training data. And in general, AI requires very large quantities of diverse data. So imagine that I did a really bad job at collecting my data so that all of the images that I train my network on have cats indoors and dogs in the grass. So what can very easily happen in this case is that the machine learning model picks up that dogs and grass seem to go together. And then whenever it sees an image with a bunch of grass, predicts dog, right? So this is obviously wrong. And it's picking up on a spurious correlation in the data set between grass and dog. Now, this is a little bit silly, and we can immediately observe that I did a bad job at putting that training data set together. But this is a real problem that's much more subtle in other contexts. Imagine, for instance, that I want to train a machine learning model to identify whether a patient has pneumonia or not based on a chest radiograph. And of course, I'm going to see an image and make a prediction, and that could easily be wrong. And what can happen, for instance, is we have to think very carefully about where this training data is coming from. So imagine that we got all of our training data from a clinic where if the doctor thought you had pneumonia, they asked for you to be scanned on scanner A. And if they thought you might have some other condition, they asked that you be scanned on scanner B. So now we have a spurious correlation. Instead of grass versus non-grass, we've got scanner A versus scanner B. But the neural network can pick up on that the same way as it can pick up on grass. And this is a real and documented problem. Neural networks can pick up on things like, how the data is acquired, how the images are processed, how the distribution pipeline, things like image compression work, instead of homing in on things that are important to the diagnosis relating to pathology. And so a prevailing challenge in AI and machine learning, as we start thinking about using them in the context of really high stakes applications, is to assess when our data is sufficiently diverse for making these high stakes decisions based on healthcare, or in the context of healthcare or finance or other things where ramifications can be quite stark. And of course, this is intimately related to the problem of being able to differentiate correlation from causation. And so this is an area where we increasingly need lots of high quality work in terms of, developing protocols for acquiring data, for testing these systems, and trying to prevent us homing in on spurious correlations falsely. Another area where I hope the next generation of AI researchers will have profound impacts is in reducing the extreme costs of training AI models. So this graphic from a couple of years ago is highlighting how much money it's costing in order to train various AI models out there. And these numbers are in the millions of US dollars. And so by using a combination of mathematics, statistics, and computer science foundations, we hope to discover new algorithms, new architectures, and new systems that can all increase the training efficiency and reduce these costs and reduce the associated impacts on the environment. Another area in which AI and machine learning are having an increasingly profound impact is in the context of the sciences. So you can easily imagine someone collecting scientific data and feeding that data into sophisticated AI tools. But really, we see AI and machine learning as having more potential than that. And in fact, impacting almost every step of the scientific method, impacting not only data analysis, but also hypothesis generation, a simulation of physical and natural systems, and even the way that we design future experiments. So this is happening throughout the natural sciences, but one example that I'd like to highlight is people thinking about generative AI, building generative models, but for the sciences. So for instance, we want to generate new examples of physical systems or physical objects in order to aid the scientific discovery process. And you might think on a superficial level that this should be extremely doable because we have such wonderful, sophisticated tools for things like text and image generation. But when we start thinking about trying to use those tools in the context of the sciences, we immediately run into major challenges. In general, in the sciences, we have much less data available than is used to train things like ChatGPT. We also have different concerns, right? If I'm trying to generate images of cats, then fine. But in the sciences, often we really care about rare events or things like chaotic dynamics in the climate that really are not of concern in more commercially oriented systems. We also have to deal with huge variations in scales and resolutions and dealing with physical models and constraints. So let me just highlight one example that some of you might have read about in the news, which is trying to develop ways to generate new climate and weather forecasts using AI. Now, people have been studying making climate forecasts for many, many years. There's been wonderful science done in this space, and we have excellent simulators already. The problem is that those simulations are extremely expensive. They require enormous supercomputers, and running those supercomputers is extremely expensive. And so this is where people are hoping to use AI to help mitigate these costs by making these simulations less expensive. So in particular, imagine that we have a simulation that can take in some parameters X and output predictions of the climate Y. So I'm just letting this curly H represent my simulation. So for instance, X could be today's weather, everything we know about the weather all over the world. And then Y could be a time series of predictions, the weather 6 hours from now, 12 hours from now, 18 hours from now, all the way out to 2 weeks from now. So people often talk about trying to design emulators or AI models that are trained to mimic this very expensive simulation at a much lower computational cost. And the idea is that what you would do is you would run your simulation a bunch of times for a bunch of different initial conditions, different weather or climate states, and then train your neural network so that it can input those same initial conditions and make predictions of what the simulator would have predicted or would have output. And the hope is that that trained neural network can be operated much more cheaply and efficiently than the classical simulation. And some of the early work in this was extremely exciting, where they were running a load of different benchmark examples of different simulations and showing billions of times of speed ups. But this is still far from a solved challenge. So for instance, one problem is that when we run these simulations, when we run these trained emulators that we've learned from simulation data, they can veer off into unexpected directions. So these are two different outputs of two different learned emulators, and everything looks pretty good. They both look like reasonable models of turbulent atmospheric dynamics, for instance. But if I skip ahead here, what we see happens after some amount of time is that this baseline model becomes unstable. All of a sudden, it's just producing totally non-physical, almost nonsense results. And this is something that can happen with a lot of these AI-trained emulators. And so what our team has been doing is been trying to think about how to design these emulators in a better way to better reflect chaotic dynamics in order to make sure that we don't veer off into these unstable, unphysical regimes and to yield better long-term forecasts than existing methods. And in fact, if I keep on running this for a really long time, ours stays really stable and well behaved for just as long as we can run it. Now, one thing I want to talk about before we conclude here is that, as you know, I'm a professor at the University of Chicago. And of course, a lot of AI innovation right now is taking place in industry in companies like Google and Meta and Apple and Microsoft. And I want to emphasize that these two groups, industry and academia, are really two different pieces of the same puzzle and really gain a lot from being together in the same ecosystem. More generally, for all of the examples I've talked about today, we've seen transformative outcomes emerging from AI. But in order to make that happen, we've needed to develop the underlying mathematical and statistical foundations, as well as having excellent domain data and expertise. And trying to have wonderful AI without those other pieces really just cannot happen. So let me give you an example. Some of you might have read about AlphaFold. This is a tool developed by DeepMind that can be used to predict the structure of a protein from the sequence of amino acids that make up that protein. And in order to do this, they needed to develop new tools for machine learning and rely on this rich source of protein structure data in the protein data bank. And these things were developed over the course of decades within universities and academia with support from organizations like the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health. And that investment has really paid off. Very recently, the DeepMind CEO said that tools like AlphaFold are going to, just revolutionize the way that we discover drugs and is going to have an enormous impact on the economy. Another example of an area where AI is having a tremendous impact is in the context of things like precision agriculture or developing autonomous vehicles or self-driving cars. These advances are things that today we often associate with industry. So autonomous vehicles, we might think of, Tesla or Waymo or something. But those advances are building again upon decades of advances from academia in mathematical and statistical foundations, things like computer visions and computer network and computer systems for fast processing. In fact, back in 2005, so 20 years ago now, DARPA had a grand challenge that really helped launch the self-driving car industry and has led to just an enormous return on investment. And we see the same kinds of trends emerging all over the place. We've already talked about weather prediction. It's happening in medical imaging, and it's even happening in detecting things like space debris that threaten our GPS systems. Now, throughout this talk, we've talked about sort of the transformative potential of AI in a variety of different settings. But of course, we'd be remiss if we didn't discuss the potential misuse of some of these tools and some of the societal implications of that. And this is something that's being explored increasingly often within the literature and within news media. Thinking about racial bias in different algorithms that are being used in high stakes applications. Thinking about the way that governments or groups can misuse AI to spread misinformation and cause enormous harm to outgroups, using it for deception and subterfuge, or impacting decisions on things like who goes to jail or who gets let out on bail. So these are all areas where we need not only technological advances, but we also need people thinking carefully about societal implications, laws, policies, and how we can make advances that can prevent some of the worst harms. And so with that, I'd like to leave you all with two key takeaways. First of all, and I really hope you all remember this, I do not have brain damage. And secondly, I hope you will all consider careers in AI or adjacent to AI. I think with this, you have enormous potential to make the world better. Thank you very much. I'd like to also thank my sponsors, the National Science Foundation and Simons Foundation Institutes for AI in the Sky, as well as for Theory in Mathematics and Biology and Schmidt Sciences. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rebecca, for your amazing speech. And we can't thank you enough for sharing your story and your work with us today. Now we'll have time for Q&A. So we have a couple questions in the chat that they'd like to be answered. So the first one is how you mentioned how limited training data can affect medical diagnosis. How can we prevent models from accidentally perpetuating bias against minorities in various fields when used in real life? So an application of AI.
Excellent. So I think part of it requires us just being very deliberate from the outset, right? It can be tempting to say, oh, here's a convenient data set that someone has already put together. I'm just going to plug it into my AI system and not give enough thought to the context in which that data set was built. And so the people building that data set might not have intended it to be used for AI. They might not have been thinking about whether it's really reflecting a diverse population or not. And so thinking very carefully about the origin of the data, the way in which it was collected and selected and processed is extremely important and has to be thought of from the very beginning, not as sort of an afterthought or when somebody notes that a method is biased. But in addition, we have to think very carefully about how these models are trained. So one of the examples that I cited at the end of my talk, I think it was a Washington Post article, their team had been very careful to make sure that the training data set had racial parity, say like equal numbers of, say, white and black people. And yet they still got this biased algorithm. And this is what went wrong. What they wanted to predict was the health outcomes of the patients in this data set. But this is sort of a nebulous concept and hard to measure. And so what they used as a proxy and tried to predict with their method was how much money people were going to be spending on their health care. And the problem is that in American society, different racial groups overall access the healthcare system differently, right? So they might have, or I shouldn't say racial groups, socioeconomic groups as well, right? They might have access to different types of healthcare, different types of health insurance. Some groups might be going to the emergency room for treatment versus clinics for treatment with different frequencies. And all of those things have correlations with things like race and ethnicity. And so even if your data set has something like racial parity, if you aren't careful about how you set up your training objectives, you can still end up with a biased system. And so it takes really deliberative care from the outset when designing these systems for every step in the process, how the data is acquired, how it's processed, how we articulate our goals, how we actually implement them and code them as we do our training, and how we test these systems in order to help avoid some of these biases.
Yes, and I agree that like considering the socioeconomic impacts of like our world today is very important when we do approach building these models. And on a similar vein, somebody asked, what is overfitting in neural networks and how can it be prevented?
Great. That's an excellent question. In fact, I might even have a backup slide. Let me check real quick. I do not. Okay, so let's see. I'm going to try to share my screen again. Okay, we did this example with the cats and the dogs. And in this case, we just learned a nice kind of straight dividing line. So we only allowed ourselves, one type of model. It had to be a straight line. But imagine that our data wasn't quite this clean, right? Like maybe there was a cat over here and a dog over here. And then we tried to draw a line that kind of scooted around to make sure it went around the cat and then scooted around to go around the dog. And it was just like super wiggly to make sure that it captured every, bizarrely shaped cat and dog that we had in our data set. So the problem with that is that we're doing a really good job at accurately outputting the label of all of our training data. But then when we have a new animal pop up, it might not, it's maybe not one of these weird outliers that we tried to fit to, and yet we're going to make a mistake on it. And so overfitting occurs when we allow ourselves to have very sophisticated and very complex models that can fit all of our training data perfectly, but then fail when we start trying to make new predictions. So for instance, I said, well, we want to be able to make an accurate prediction for a new dog here. But if our training data had had a cat here, and I had made my line curve around to fit that cat, then I would be inaccurately predicting that this dog is a cat. So that would be an example of overfitting. I'm trying to make sure I'm so good on my training data that then when I actually deploy it in the wild, I do a terrible job. So now then the second part of the question was, well, how do we avoid this? And that's a great question. One classical way to avoid it is to just try to come up with simple rules for separating out the different classes. So in this case, for instance, saying I'm only going to allow myself to have straight lines. Or maybe I could say, I'm going to allow my line to have a little curve, but it can't be too curvy. Those are kind of classical ways in which we can prevent overfitting. What people are observing is that even when we don't explicitly make those sorts of complicated rules, we often still do not observe overfitting. And the process of training these neural networks, of selecting all of the weights in these big complex networks, just that optimization process is implicitly inducing a kind of smoothness or a type of constraint that helps prevent overfitting in some cases. And this is something that's still being actively explored, and we're still trying to understand it in a variety of different contexts.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we are running out of time because we do want to get all of our attendees to our Tech Plus X sessions, but I want to say thank you one more time to Dr. Willett, and let's have everyone give her thanks and goodbyes in the chat. But thank you so much.
Thank you. It was really my pleasure, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your conference.
All right, so now for the rest of the afternoon, make sure to catch all of the exciting professional development and Tech Plus X sessions happening. Here is the schedule for today. We highly encourage you to join as many sessions as you're interested in and can. And don't forget to check your emails for the GirlCon Zoom background, which you can download. You can scan this QR code to access the master document with the schedule as well as all the Zoom links for every session. And don't forget to fill out the feedback form after each session as you attend. As attendees who provide the most feedback will get a swag bag from us containing our personally designed tote bags, t-shirts, stickers, and more merch. Now, we don't want to keep you all here any longer, so hop on those documents and join some sessions. Thank you.